The morning mist clung to Ashford Hall like a shroud, wrapping the grey stone walls in layers of cold October air that seemed to seep into the very bones of the estate. Inside the cavernous study on the second floor, Sebastian Blackwood, Duke of Ashford, sat behind a mahogany desk that had belonged to 4 generations of dukes before him, though he suspected he might be the last to bear the title with any dignity intact. The ledgers spread before him told a story of slow decay: his father's gambling debts, his grandfather's poor investments, the weight of a crumbling legacy that rested entirely on his shoulders. At 32, Sebastian had long since learned to keep his heart as cold and calculating as the numbers in those leather-bound books. Emotion was a luxury he could not afford. The dukedom required an heir, nothing more, nothing less, and sentiment had no place in matters of survival. He picked up the marriage contract with fingers that did not tremble, scanned the terms with eyes that registered only the practical elements: dowry, settlements, expectations clearly outlined. Lady Catherine Hartley, 24, unmarried, from a respectable if financially struggling family. Her father, Lord Hartley, was desperate enough to agree to Sebastian's cold terms, grateful enough not to expect anything resembling affection. Perfect. The sound of carriage wheels on gravel announced her arrival precisely at 11, as scheduled. Sebastian did not rise from his desk, did not move to the window to catch a glimpse of his future duchess. What did it matter what she looked like? She was a means to an end, a solution to a problem, a vessel for the heir that would secure the Ashford line. When Pemberton showed her into the study some minutes later, Sebastian glanced up with the same dispassion he might afford a new piece of furniture. Lady Catherine Hartley stood in the doorway, her hands clasped before her, her travelling cloak still damp from the mist. She was small, slight, dressed in a grey day dress that did nothing to distinguish her from the dreary morning outside. Mousy brown hair pulled back severely, eyes downcast, unremarkable features arranged in an expression of resigned dutifulness. Forgettable, good, he would not be distracted by beauty or charm. "Lady Catherine," he said, his voice clipped and businesslike, "please sit." She moved to the chair across from him with quiet steps, settling into it with a grace that he barely registered. "Your father has explained the arrangement?" "Yes, Your Grace." Her voice was soft, steady, revealing nothing. "I understand the terms. Then we need not belabor the particulars. You will become Duchess of Ashford. You will manage the household, fulfill social obligations, and provide an heir. In return, you will have security, position, and your family's debts will be settled." He slid the contract across the desk. "If these terms are acceptable, sign here." For the briefest moment, Catherine's eyes lifted to meet his grey eyes, he noted absently, like the morning outside, and something flickered in their depths that might have been disappointment or resignation, or perhaps simply acknowledgement of reality. Then she looked down, took the offered pen, and signed her name in a neat, controlled hand. "The wedding will be 3 weeks from today," Sebastian stated, already returning his attention to the ledgers. "Pemberton will coordinate the details with your family. You may go." She rose, curtsied a gesture he barely acknowledged, and left as quietly as she had come, leaving behind only the faint scent of lavender and the signed contract that would bind them together for life. Sebastian filed the document away and returned to his accounts, dismissing Lady Catherine Hartley from his thoughts entirely. She was now simply another item checked off his list of obligations, nothing more. He did not know, could not have known, that the forgettable woman in grey would one day become the only thing in his world that truly mattered. But before our lover's fate is revealed, subscribe so you never miss a chapter of romance and scandal, and tell us in the comments, where are you watching from? Now, let's begin. The chapel at Ashford Hall had never seemed so vast or so cold as it did on the November morning when Catherine Hartley became Catherine Blackwood, Duchess of Ashford. The ceremony was attended by obligation rather than joy, a scattering of family members who came because propriety demanded it, society figures who came to witness the Duke finally do his duty, and not a single soul who came for love. Catherine stood at the altar in a cream silk gown that had belonged to Sebastian's mother, altered hastily to fit her smaller frame, and repeated vows that felt like signing away the last remnants of girlish dreams she hadn't even realized she still harbored. She had known what this was, had accepted the terms with open eyes, yet some foolish part of her heart had whispered that perhaps, somehow, in time, he might come to care for her, and might see her as more than a contractual obligation. She glanced at Sebastian as the vicar droned through the liturgy. His profile was carved from marble, beautiful and utterly remote, his jaw set with the same grim determination one might bring to an unpleasant but necessary task. When he placed the ring on her finger, his touch was brief, impersonal, and he did not meet her eyes. Sebastian's thoughts, had Catherine been able to read them, would have offered little comfort. He calculated timelines as he made his vows, how long before she might conceive, how many months until an heir secured the succession, how soon he could return his full attention to salvaging the estate's finances. The woman beside him was a blur of cream, silk, and nervous breathing, as indistinct in his mind as she had been in his study 3 weeks prior. He felt nothing beyond a sense of completion, of one more step taken toward securing his family's legacy. The wedding breakfast that followed was a stilted affair of forced pleasantries and knowing glances from guests who understood exactly what sort of marriage this was. Catherine smiled until her cheeks ached and said all the right things while feeling utterly alone in a room full of people. When the last guest finally departed and twilight settled over the estate, Catherine found herself standing in the Duchess's chambers, her chambers now being prepared by silent maids for her wedding night. The room was lovely, she supposed, decorated in shades of blue and silver, but it felt as cold as everything else in this house. Sebastian came to her after full dark, entering through the connecting door between their rooms with the same businesslike manner he brought to all his affairs. What followed was respectful, careful, technically correct in every way, and utterly devoid of tenderness. He fulfilled his husbandly duty with the efficiency of a man checking items off a list, never cruel but never warm, his hands impersonal, even in their most intimate moments. When it was finished, he rose, adjusted his dressing gown, and spoke his first words since entering the room. "Good night, Catherine." Then he was gone, the connecting door closing with a soft click that seemed to echo in the silence. Catherine lay perfectly still in the darkness, the sheets cool against her skin, and felt a single tear slide down her temple into her hair. This was her life now, this beautiful prison, this cold marriage, this man who would never see her, never want her, never love her. In the weeks that followed, they settled into a routine of careful avoidance. They maintained separate lives within the same house, passing each other in hallways with polite nods, sharing silent dinners when obligation required it, existing in parallel rather than together. Sebastian buried himself in estate business, leaving early and returning late. Catherine learned the rhythms of a household that ran efficiently without requiring her input, wandered rooms that echoed with emptiness, and slowly, quietly, resigned herself to a lifetime of being invisible to the one person whose regard she most desired. 2 months into her marriage, Catherine had begun to understand the true scope of neglect that had settled over Ashford Hall like dust over forgotten furniture. The estate was grand, yes, but it was a grandeur fading at the edges, curtains grown thin with age, carpets worn in the centers, a pervasive chill that spoke of economies made in coal and fires lit only when absolutely necessary. More than the physical deterioration, she noticed the servants, how they moved through their duties with mechanical efficiency, but without any warmth. How they startled when she spoke kindly to them, how Mrs. Pemberton, the housekeeper, had actual tears in her eyes when Catherine asked her opinion on updating the linens. It seemed kindness had been as scarce in this house as heat. Catherine began making small changes, subtle ones that wouldn't draw Sebastian's attention or disapproval. She ordered fires lit in the morning rooms, making spaces warm and welcoming. She asked cook about the staff's meals and quietly authorized better provisions. She learned the servants' names, inquired about their families, thanked them for their work. Slowly, almost imperceptibly, Ashford Hall began to feel less like a mausoleum and more like a home, at least in the corners where Catherine's influence reached. Sebastian noticed none of it. He remained buried in his ledgers and correspondence, leaving the house at dawn, and often not returning until after dark. On the evenings when they shared dinner, a concession to propriety rather than any desire for companionship, Catherine attempted small conversations. "The gardens might be lovely come spring if we engaged a proper gardener," she ventured one evening. Sebastian responded, not looking up from the document he was reading between courses. "Mrs. Pemberton mentioned the village is planning a harvest festival. Perhaps we might, if you wish." Another evening, I've been reviewing the household accounts, and I noticed, that's your domain. Handle it as you see fit. Monosyllables and dismissals. Catherine learned to eat in silence. She found her solace in the library, that vast room on the eastern side of the house, filled with books accumulated over generations. Here, at least, she could escape into other worlds, other lives, stories where people loved and were loved in return. She read voraciously poetry and philosophy, novels and natural history, losing herself for hours among the leather-bound volumes. It was in the library that Sebastian found her one evening in late January, though he had only entered to retrieve a specific legal text he required. The fire had burned low, casting the room in shadows and amber light, and at first he thought the room empty. Then he saw her, curled in the large wingback chair by the window, a book open in her lap, her head tilted against the chair's high back in sleep. Sebastian stood motionless in the doorway, the legal text forgotten. For the first time since their wedding, perhaps for the first time since meeting her, he actually looked at his wife. Really looked. In sleep, the careful blankness she wore like armor had fallen away, revealing something softer, younger, almost peaceful. The firelight caught in her brown hair, turning it amber and gold where he had only ever seen it as mousy and plain. There was a gentle curve to her cheek, a delicacy to the line of her jaw that he had never registered. His eyes fell to the book in her lap, Locke's Essay Concerning Human Understanding. Not a novel or poetry as he might have expected, but philosophy, and dense philosophy at that. Something stirred in his chest, unfamiliar and unwelcome. She was a person, he realized with uncomfortable surprise, not merely a function, a person with thoughts and intelligence, who read Locke by firelight and fell asleep in library chairs. A person he had treated as little more than furniture for 2 months. The feeling that stirred in him might have been shame, or perhaps the first hairline crack in the careful walls he had built around anything resembling his heart. He found himself moving quietly across the room, taking the blanket from the back of the settee and draping it gently over her sleeping form. She stirred slightly but did not wake. Sebastian stood there a moment longer, disturbed by his own actions, by the strange protectiveness that had prompted them, by the way the firelight played across her features. Then he turned and left quickly, closing the library door with care, the legal text still forgotten on its shelf. That night, alone in his chambers, he found himself thinking not of ledgers or obligations, but of the gentle curve of a cheek in firelight and the uncomfortable realization that he had been living in a house with a stranger he had never bothered to see. 3 months into her marriage, Catherine woke to a now familiar wave of nausea that sent her rushing to the basin in her dressing room, her maid following with worried efficiency. It had been happening for a week now, these morning illnesses, along with a bone-deep fatigue that made even the simplest tasks feel monumental and a peculiar tenderness that made her stays uncomfortable. She suspected. Of course she was not naive about these matters, but she hardly dared to hope, hardly dared to name the possibility, even in the privacy of her own thoughts. When Dr. Thornbury confirmed what her body had already whispered, Catherine felt a confusing tangle of emotions rise in her throat. Joy, certainly there was a life growing within her, a child she would love with all the affection she had been storing up, with nowhere to spend it. Wonder at the miracle of it, this tiny being forming in secret, but beneath the joy lay a deep, aching sorrow, because she knew with devastating certainty what this news would mean to Sebastian. Not happiness, not tenderness, simply satisfaction that she had performed her function adequately. The child would matter to him, but she never would. She waited until dinner to tell him, those interminable silent dinners they endured twice weekly for propriety's sake. Her hands trembled slightly as she set down her fork, and she had to force the words past the tightness in her throat. "Sebastian, I have news. Dr. Thornbury confirmed it this afternoon. I am with child." For a moment, his face remained impassive, unreadable. Then something shifted, not joy, not excitement, but a look of profound relief, of satisfaction, as though he had made a risky investment that had finally paid dividends. "Well done," he said, and the words struck her like a physical blow. "You've fulfilled your primary duty admirably. This secures the succession." He took a sip of his wine, his mind already moving to practicalities. "I'll summon the solicitors tomorrow to update the will. We'll need to prepare the nursery, the one in the East Wing, I think, where my mother kept me, and you'll require the best physicians throughout, naturally. Cost is no object when it comes to producing a healthy heir. Catherine sat frozen, her dinner congealing on her plate, each word falling on her like stones. Primary duty, succession, heir. Not once did he say, "Our child." Not once did he look at her with anything resembling warmth or shared joy. She was a broodmare who had performed adequately, nothing more. "Yes, Your Grace," she managed, her voice steady though her heart was shattering. "I'm pleased the news satisfies you." If he noticed the careful choice of words satisfies rather than pleases, he gave no indication. He was already planning, calculating, that familiar distant expression settling over his features as he considered logistics and timelines. The rest of the dinner passed in merciful brevity. When Catherine finally escaped to her chambers, dismissed the concerned maid with assurances she needed nothing, she lay down on her bed fully clothed and let the tears come. They soaked into her pillow as she pressed her face into the silk, muffling the sounds of her weeping. She placed a hand over her still flat stomach, over the life growing there, and felt the cruel irony of it all. This child, this precious, wanted child, would be the heir Sebastian cared about, the person who mattered in his cold calculation of duty and lineage. But she, who carried the child and would birth it and love it with every fiber of her being, would remain invisible, a vessel that had served its purpose and could now be set aside and forgotten. "I will love you," she whispered to the tiny life within her. "Even if your father never loves me, I will love you enough for both of us." The words were a promise and a surrender, an acceptance of her fate. She had harbored foolish hopes these past weeks, especially since that night she had woken in the library to find a blanket tucked around her, hopes that perhaps Sebastian might soften, might see her, might learn to care. But his reaction tonight had burned those hopes to ash. The child would change everything and nothing. Everything in this house would revolve around the heir, and she would remain exactly what she had always been, invisible, unnecessary, alone. The 4th month of Catherine's pregnancy brought a change in Sebastian's behavior, though not the change her foolish heart might have wished for. He became attentive in the way a gentleman farmer might become attentive to a prized mare, carrying valuable foal, solicitous of her condition, meticulous about her care, but never actually seeing her as anything beyond the vessel she represented. Dr. Thornbury was summoned weekly for examinations. Cook received detailed instructions about nutrition appropriate for expectant mothers. Sebastian personally reviewed the menu to ensure Catherine received adequate sustenance. He forbade her from undertaking any strenuous activity, left instructions with the servants to monitor her rest, and imported a special tonic from London that was reputed to prevent complications. All of this he did with the same business-like efficiency he brought to managing his tenants or overseeing the spring planting. Not once did he ask Catherine how she felt, whether she was frightened, if she needed comfort rather than tonics. His concern was for the heir, and the distinction was painfully clear. Catherine grew quieter as the weeks passed, withdrawing into herself like a flower closing at dusk. She spoke less at their infrequent dinners, stopped attempting conversations that went nowhere, moved through the house like a ghost in her own home. The servants noticed. They whispered among themselves about the sad Duchess who never smiled, who spent hours in the library or sitting by windows staring at nothing, who thanked them for the smallest kindnesses with a gratitude that spoke of deep loneliness. Mrs. Pemberton, who had served the Blackwood family for 30 years and had a maternal heart beneath her efficient exterior, took to bringing Catherine tea in the afternoons and staying to chat. In the housekeeper's warm presence, Catherine found the only genuine companionship in her cold marriage, and sometimes, in the safety of those afternoon teas, she allowed herself to speak of small sorrows and quiet disappointments. It was on a grey afternoon in late March that Catherine miscalculated her own strength. She had been in the library, always the library, her refuge, and was descending the main staircase when a wave of dizziness overtook her. The stairs seemed to tilt, her vision blurred at the edges, and she reached out for the banister but found only air. She felt herself falling forward, time slowing to a terrible crawl, and in that suspended moment she thought only of the child, of failing even in this, her one purpose. Then strong hands caught her, arms encircling her waist and pulling her back from the edge. The world righted itself, and she found herself pressed against Sebastian's chest, his heart pounding beneath her cheek, his arms locked around her with startling strength. For several seconds neither of them moved, both breathing hard from the shock of it. Catherine became acutely aware of every point of contact, his hands at her waist, the warmth of his body through the layers of fabric, the scent of sandalwood and ink that clung to him. Something jolted through her at the contact, a spark of recognition her body felt even if her mind refused to acknowledge it. This was the first time he had touched her since their wedding night, the first time she had been close enough to feel his breath stir her hair. Sebastian felt it too, that unexpected jolt, and it disturbed him profoundly. He had been passing through the hall when he saw her sway at the top of the stairs, had moved without thinking, and now found himself holding his wife, really holding her for the first time. She was so light, so fragile in his arms, and the fear that had seized him when he saw her falling was entirely disproportionate to mere concern for his heir. That realization unsettled him. "You must be more careful," he said, and his voice came out rougher than he intended, almost harsh with an emotion he could not name. He lifted her easily, she weighed almost nothing, and carried her up the stairs toward her chambers, acutely conscious of how she fit against his chest, of the way her hand clutched his shoulder. He deposited her on the chaise in her sitting room with more haste than gentleness, stepping back as though burned. For just a moment, their eyes met, and something flickered in his genuine concern, perhaps even fear before the familiar cold mask descended. "Rest. I'll send for Dr. Thornbury." Then he was gone, the door closing firmly behind him. Catherine sat motionless on the chaise, her heart still racing, and without quite meaning to, she touched her arm where his hands had gripped her, where she could still feel the ghost of his touch burning through her sleeve. She was confused by her own reaction, by the way her traitorous body had responded to his nearness, by the brief glimpse of something human in his eyes before he shuttered it away. It meant nothing, she told herself firmly. He had simply been protecting his investment. But her hand remained on her arm, and she could not quite convince herself that the moment had been as empty as she claimed. As April arrived and the season began in earnest, Sebastian announced over dinner that they would attend the Pemberton ball. "Appearances matter," he stated, cutting his beef with mechanical precision. "We must present a united front. The ton will expect to see the Duke and Duchess of Ashford, especially now that you're visibly carrying the heir." Catherine's fork paused halfway to her mouth, anxiety immediately tightening in her chest. She had never been comfortable in society, had always been the overlooked girl at the edge of ballrooms, the forgettable wallflower whom gentlemen's eyes slid past without registering. Now she would attend as a duchess, yes, but also as a woman 5 months pregnant in a marriage everyone knew to be purely transactional, a spectacle for gossips to dissect and pity. "Of course," she murmured, because what else could she say? Sebastian didn't notice the tension in her voice, the way her hands trembled slightly as she set down her fork. He was already mentally preparing for the business discussions he would conduct, the political alliances he might strengthen, the financial opportunities such gatherings presented. That Catherine might be anxious, might dread the exposure, never crossed his calculating mind. The night of the ball, Catherine's maid dressed her with unusual care in a gown of rose-colored silk that had been specially made to accommodate her changing figure. The color brought unexpected warmth to her complexion, made her grey eyes look almost luminous, and the cut, while modest, somehow transformed her from forgettable to something approaching elegance. When she descended the stairs to meet Sebastian in the entrance hall, she saw something flicker across his face, surprise perhaps, or that strange stirring he had felt when he caught her on the staircase weeks ago. For a moment, he simply looked at her, really looked, and thought that she appeared almost beautiful in the candlelight, the rose silk making her seem less like the invisible woman he had married, and more like someone he might have noticed in other circumstances. "You look presentable," he said finally, the compliment, so grudging it barely qualified as one, and whatever warmth Catherine had felt at his expression died instantly. At the ball, Sebastian fulfilled his word about presenting a united front for precisely as long as it took to make their entrance and accept initial congratulations on the impending heir. Then he excused himself to speak with Lord Hartwell about some business matter, leaving Catherine standing alone near a pillar, her hand resting protectively over the swell of her belly, visibly pregnant and visibly abandoned. The looks began almost immediately, the pitying glances from matrons who understood exactly what sort of marriage this was, the whispered conversations behind fans, the careful distance maintained by those who saw her as nothing more than a duty fulfilled. Catherine held her head high and smiled blandly, dying 1,000 small deaths inside, wishing she could simply disappear into the wallpaper as she had always done before. "The duty matches are always the loneliest, aren't they?" a warm voice said beside her, and Catherine turned to find an elegant woman of perhaps 40, dressed in lavender silk, regarding her with kind eyes that held understanding rather than pity. "I'm Henrietta Blackwood, Sebastian's cousin. Well, cousin by marriage. I was wed to his cousin James, before James had the poor grace to fall off his horse and break his neck 5 years ago." The frankness of it startled a small, genuine smile from Catherine. "I'm sorry for your loss." "Are you?" Henrietta asked with gentle perception. "Or are you wondering if widowhood might be preferable to what you're currently enduring?" Catherine's smile faltered, and she looked away, unable to answer such a direct question from a stranger, even a kind one. Henrietta took her arm with easy familiarity, steering her toward a quieter corner. "Forgive me. James always said I had all the subtlety of a cavalry charge, but I've been watching you stand here alone while my cold bastard of a cousin conducts his precious business, and I thought you might appreciate a friendly face." They found seats in an alcove, partially hidden from the ballroom's scrutiny, and Henrietta spoke with the easy confidence of someone who had survived her own trials and come out stronger. She spoke of her own marriage, which had been affectionate but passionless, of the loneliness that could exist even in company, of learning to find purpose beyond what others expected of you. Catherine listened, hungry for this connection, for someone who seemed to see her as an actual person rather than a decorative appendage or a breeding vessel. "Does it get easier?" Catherine asked quietly, the question escaping before she could stop it. "Living with someone who doesn't see you?" Henrietta's expression softened with sympathy. "Sometimes. And sometimes you learn to see yourself clearly enough that it matters less whether others do." She patted Catherine's hand. "Though between us, I hold out hope that Sebastian might yet surprise you. The Blackwood men are notoriously slow to recognize what's valuable until they nearly lose it." Henrietta's presence had been a balm, but as the evening wore on, Catherine became increasingly aware of her own discomfort. The ballroom was stifling, packed with bodies and lit by hundreds of candles that turned the air thick and warm. Her corset, already tight against her growing body despite the maid's careful adjustments, seemed to constrict further with each breath. A dull ache had begun in her lower back, radiating around to her abdomen, and beneath the layers of silk and linen she felt perspiration gathering at her temples. Her neck. She took a sip of lemonade, trying to calm the rising sense that something was wrong, that her body was protesting this spectacle in ways she could not control. "Are you quite well?" Henrietta asked, her sharp eyes catching the pallor that had crept into Catherine's cheeks. "You've gone rather white." "Just warm," Catherine managed, though even as she spoke the room seemed to tilt slightly at the edges. "Perhaps I should find Sebastian." She rose, steadying herself on the chair back, and scanned the ballroom for her husband. There, across the room, deep in animated conversation with Lord Hartwell and 2 other gentlemen, his attention completely absorbed in whatever business matter they were discussing. He had not looked her direction once in the past hour. Catherine began making her way through the crowd, murmuring polite excuses as she navigated between clusters of guests. The distance seemed to stretch impossibly, the faces around her blurring into a sea of curiosity and false smiles. Halfway across the ballroom floor, the ache in her abdomen suddenly sharpened into something else entirely, a pain that stole her breath and doubled her over. She reached out blindly for something to steady herself, her hand grasping only air. The ballroom tilted violently, the chandeliers overhead wheeling in sickening circles. She could feel eyes on her, could hear the shift in conversation as people noticed the Duchess of Ashford swaying dangerously in the center of the dance floor. "Sebastian," she tried to call, but his name came out as barely a whisper, lost in the music and chatter. The pain intensified, sharp and frightening and utterly wrong. Her vision darkened at the edges, a tunnel closing in until all she could see was a pinpoint of light, the gleam of candlelight on marble. She felt her legs give way beneath her, felt herself falling with terrible slow clarity, and then nothing. Darkness swallowed her whole. The orchestra faltered and stopped mid-phrase, the sudden silence more shocking than any scream. For a heartbeat, the entire ballroom froze in tableau dancers mid-step, conversationalists mid-sentence, fans arrested in mid-flutter. Then chaos erupted, gasps and exclamations, the rush of movement as people surged forward or shrank back, the clatter of a dropped glass shattering on marble. In the center of the dance floor, a pool of rose-colored silk lay crumpled and still. Sebastian heard the disturbance before he registered what caused it, the cessation of music, the collective gasp, the sudden urgency in voices around him. He turned, irritated at the interruption to his conversation, and his eyes found the center of the ballroom. Time stopped. The world narrowed to a single, terrible point of focus. Rose-colored silk pooled on white marble, brown hair coming loose from its pins, a hand outstretched and motionless. Catherine, his wife, collapsed. Something in Sebastian's chest seized with a force that knocked the breath from his lungs. This was not concern for an heir or calculation about succession. This was pure, primal fear, the kind that bypasses thought entirely and strikes directly at something deeper, something he had not even known existed in his carefully controlled interior landscape. He was moving before conscious decision, shoving through the crowd with no regard for propriety or rank, dropping to his knees beside her with no thought for his expensive evening clothes or the hundreds of eyes watching. "Catherine," he said, and her name on his lips sounded wrong, foreign, because he so rarely spoke it. His hands hovered over her, afraid to touch, afraid not to. Her face was grey-white, her lips slightly parted, and she was so terribly, utterly still. The ballroom spun around him, voices calling for doctors, for air, for someone to do something, but Sebastian heard none of it. His entire world had contracted to the woman lying motionless before him, and the devastating realization that crashed over him like a wave. He could not lose her, not the air, her. When had that happened? How had she become essential without his noticing? Sebastian gathered Catherine into his arms with hands that trembled, actually trembled, though he could not remember the last time his body had betrayed him with such weakness. She was so light, so terribly pale, her head lolling against his shoulder as he lifted her from the cold marble. "Catherine," he said again, louder this time, as though the force of his voice might call her back from wherever she had gone. There was no response, no flutter of eyelids, nothing but the shallow rise and fall of her chest that told him she still lived. "Doctor." Thornbury materialized beside him. Lord Pemberton was calling for his carriage to be brought around immediately, and Henrietta's voice cut through the chaos with orders to clear a path. Sebastian carried his wife through the parting crowd, aware of nothing but her weight in his arms and the terrifying fragility of it. How easily this life could slip away if he did not hold on tightly enough. The carriage ride back to Ashford Hall was the longest journey of Sebastian's life. He sat with Catherine cradled against his chest, one arm supporting her shoulders, his other hand pressed against her belly where his child grew, trying to feel movement, reassurance, anything. Her head rested in the hollow of his throat, her breathing soft and worryingly shallow against his skin. "Doctor." Thornbury sat across from them, his face grave, checking her pulse at intervals and saying nothing, which was somehow worse than any pronouncement might have been. Sebastian's heart pounded with a fear he had not felt since childhood, since the night his mother died, and he learned that all the titles and wealth in the world could not protect you from loss. But this fear was different, more acute, edged with something that felt dangerously close to panic. He was not afraid of losing his heir, and he realized with shocking clarity. He was afraid of losing her, Catherine, his wife. The woman he had treated as little more than a means to an end, whom he had ignored and dismissed and kept at careful distance for 5 months. When had she become essential? When had the thought of a world without her in it become unbearable? He looked down at her face, so still in the dim carriage light, and tried to trace the path of his own transformation. Was it that night in the library when he first truly saw her, the moment on the stairs when he caught her and felt that jolt of recognition? Or had it been happening slowly all along? In accumulated moments he had refused to acknowledge her quiet competence with the household, her kindness to the servants, the intelligence in her choice of books, the way she never complained though he gave her every reason to. At Ashford Hall, he carried her directly to her chambers, refusing to relinquish her to servants, or even to Dr. Thornbury, until absolutely necessary. When the physician finally insisted he needed space to examine her properly, Sebastian retreated only as far as the corner of the room, standing rigid as carved stone, while Thornbury conducted his examination. The minutes stretched into eternities. Sebastian's mind, usually so ordered and calculating, spun in unfamiliar chaos. If she died, if both she and the child died, it would be his fault. His cold neglect, his insistence on dragging her to that ball when she was clearly not well enough, his complete failure to notice her distress. He had been so focused on his business discussions, so absorbed in his own concerns, that he had not even looked at her for hours, had not seen her growing pale, struggling, trying to reach him. She had been collapsing in the center of a ballroom while he discussed grain prices with Lord Hartwell, and the guilt of that struck him with physical force. "Doctor," Thornbury finally straightened, his expression carefully neutral in the way of physicians delivering uncertain news. "Her Grace is stable for the moment. The child appears unharmed, I can feel movement, but she's severely overtaxed, possibly dehydrated, and there are signs of strain that concern me. The next hours will be critical. She needs complete rest and careful monitoring." Sebastian nodded, unable to form words past the tightness in his throat. As Thornbury gathered his instruments and gave instructions to the hovering maid, Sebastian moved to the chair beside Catherine's bed and sat heavily, his eyes fixed on her colorless face. He reached out hesitantly and took her hand so small and cold in his larger one, and made a silent promise to whoever might be listening. If she survived this, if she opened her eyes again, he would be different. Better. He would see her, truly see her, the way he should have from the beginning. He would not waste whatever chance he might be given to know the woman he had married. The woman who had somehow, without his permission or awareness, become the person he most feared losing in all the world. Catherine woke to pale morning light filtering through unfamiliar curtains. No, not unfamiliar, simply disorienting in her confused state. These were her own bed curtains, her own room, but something felt wrong, displaced, as though time had skipped forward without her consent. Her body ached with a deep weariness, and her throat was parched. She turned her head on the pillow and found Sebastian sitting in the chair beside her bed, and the shock of it brought everything rushing back the ballroom, the pain, the terrible spinning darkness. Sebastian looked nothing like the composed duke who had escorted her to the ball. His evening clothes were rumpled and creased, his cravat missing entirely, his dark hair disheveled as though he had run his hands through it repeatedly. His eyes were shadowed with exhaustion, and stubble darkened his jaw. He looked, Catherine thought with distant surprise, almost human. Their eyes met, and something passed between them that had never existed before, a connection, tentative and fragile, but undeniably real. "You're awake," he said, and his voice was rough with relief. He leaned forward, and she saw his hand twitch as though he wanted to reach for her but didn't quite dare. "How do you feel?" "Tired," she whispered. "The baby is safe," Dr. Thornbury confirmed it. "Strong heartbeat, good movement. You gave us all a considerable fright, but the child is unharmed. Us, not me. Us." As though there were others whose concern mattered, though Catherine suspected he meant primarily himself and simply could not say it. "I'm sorry," she began, the apology automatic. "I didn't mean to cause a scene, Catherine." He said her name with surprising firmness, and this time his hand did move, covering hers on the counterpane with hesitant gentleness. "You frightened me." The words hung in the air between them, simple and devastating. Not, "You endangered the heir," or "You jeopardized the succession." "You frightened me." Catherine stared at him, unable to formulate a response, unsure what this meant, afraid to read too much into 3 words spoken in a moment of crisis. Sebastian seemed equally uncertain what to do with the confession now that it had escaped. His hand remained on hers, warm and solid, but his expression was confused, as though he had surprised himself. "You must rest," he said finally, withdrawing his hand with what might have been reluctance. "Recover your strength. Dr. Thornbury's orders are absolute bed rest for at least a week, possibly longer. I've instructed the staff that you're to have anything you need." He stood, and Catherine thought he would leave as he always did, retreating to his separate sphere. Instead, he paused at the foot of the bed, his hands gripping the carved post. "I'll return this afternoon if you're amenable. Perhaps I might read to you. You shouldn't be alone." Then he was gone, leaving Catherine to stare at the closed door in bewildered wonder. In the days that followed, Sebastian became a fixture in her chambers in a way that would have been scandalous had anyone outside the household known. He came every afternoon, settling into the chair beside her bed with whatever book she requested, sometimes novels, sometimes poetry, occasionally the philosophy she favored. His voice, reading aloud, was surprisingly pleasant, deep and measured, stumbling occasionally over romantic passages, as though unsure how to voice such sentiments. Sometimes they talked between chapters, small conversations at first, careful and circling, but gradually deepening. He asked about her childhood, her interests, opinions he had never bothered to solicit before. She answered cautiously, still uncertain of this shift, waiting for the cold Duke to reassert himself. But he didn't. Sometimes he simply sat in silence while she dozed, and she would wake to find him still there, watching her with an expression she could not decipher. The walls between them, so carefully constructed and ruthlessly maintained, developed hairline cracks that widened with each visit. Mrs. Pemberton observed these afternoon vigils with knowing smiles and made sure to bring extra tea, setting 2 cups on the table, though Sebastian never asked. The other servants whispered among themselves that his grace was changing, softening, though none could say precisely when it had begun. Sebastian himself could not have answered that question. He only knew that the chair beside Catherine's bed had become the place where he was most at ease, that the sound of her voice discussing Locke or Byron had become something he looked forward to, and the thought of losing her had cracked something open inside him that he had kept locked and frozen for so long he had forgotten it existed. He was changing, transforming in ways he did not fully understand, drawn toward the quiet woman in the bed by a force he could neither name nor resist. And for the first time in his carefully controlled life, Sebastian Blackwood was not sure he wanted to resist at all. By the 6th month of her pregnancy, Catherine had recovered sufficiently for Dr. Thornbury to permit gentle exercise, provided she did not overexert herself. Sebastian, who had taken to interpreting the physician's instructions with an almost comical degree of caution, announced that she should take daily walks in the garden for fresh air and constitution, but only with him present to ensure she did not tax herself. Catherine agreed, bemused by this sudden solicitousness from a man who had barely acknowledged her existence for the first 4 months of their marriage. The walks began as silent affairs, awkward in their newness. They would traverse the gravel paths at a sedate pace, befitting Catherine's condition, Sebastian hovering at her elbow as though she might collapse at any moment, neither quite sure what to say now that they had left the safe territory of her sick room and the books that had mediated their tentative connection. But gradually, as April warmed into May and the gardens came alive with early roses and blooming lilac, Catherine began to speak. At first, she commented on small things, the progress of the gardener's work, the beauty of a particular flower bed, the way the light fell through the ancient oak at the garden's center. Then, emboldened by Sebastian's attentive silence, she began to share more. She spoke of the books she had been reading, drawing connections between philosophical concepts and practical applications. She mentioned the improvements she had quietly implemented in the household, the better provisions for servants, the repairs to the east wing that had been leaking, the reorganization of the linen closets that had saved considerable expense. She offered observations about the world, about politics and society and human nature, thoughts she had been storing up in months of solitude with no one to share them with. Sebastian found himself not merely listening but truly hearing her, perhaps for the first time in his life, attending fully to another person's words without simultaneously calculating his own advantage. She was intelligent, remarkably so, with an incisive mind that cut through pretense to underlying truth. She was observant, noticing details about the estate and its people that had escaped his ledger-focused attention. And she was kind, consistently and genuinely kind, in a way that seemed entirely foreign to Sebastian's experience. How had he never noticed any of this? How had he lived in the same house with this woman for 6 months and remained completely ignorant of who she actually was? The realization shamed him even as it fascinated him. One afternoon, as they walked past the section of garden where an overly earnest previous duke had installed a collection of stone gnomes, Catherine made a wry comment about their expressions, suggesting they were passing judgment on the current residents' horticultural choices. The observation was so unexpected, so gently absurd, that Sebastian found himself smiling. Catherine, emboldened, added that the one by the roses looked particularly disapproving of the pruning strategy, and perhaps they should consult him before making any further decisions. And then she laughed, a genuine, unguarded sound of amusement that transformed her entire face, lighting her grey eyes and softening features that melancholy had kept carefully controlled. The sound stopped Sebastian in his tracks. He stood motionless on the gravel path, staring at his wife as she smiled at her own silly joke, and realized with absolute certainty that he had never heard her laugh before. Not once in 6 months of marriage, the thought struck him with unexpected force that he had shared a home, a bed, however briefly, a future with this woman, and had never once made her laugh, or even wanted to. What kind of existence had he condemned her to? What kind of man had he been? But more than the guilt, he felt something else entirely, a fierce, inexplicable desire to hear that sound again, to be the cause of it. To see her face light with genuine joy and know that he had put that expression there. That night, long after they had completed their walk and parted for their separate chambers, Sebastian lay awake staring at the canopy above his bed. His mind, usually occupied with figures and strategies and the endless calculations required to maintain a failing estate, wandered instead to the way afternoon sunlight had caught in Catherine's brown hair, turning it gold and amber, to the intelligence in her grey eyes when she spoke about philosophy, to the kindness in her voice when she mentioned the servants by name, knowing their families and concerns, to the sound of her laughter, rare and precious as a flower blooming in winter. When had this happened? This preoccupation with a woman he had married purely for practical purposes. When had Catherine stopped being a function and become a person more than a person, become someone whose happiness suddenly mattered more than his carefully laid plans? Sebastian did not have answers, only the uncomfortable awareness that something fundamental had shifted in him, and there would be no shifting back. Sebastian began appearing at dinner with a regularity that surprised the servants and bewildered Catherine. Where before he had attended perhaps twice weekly out of sheer obligation, often with papers to review between courses, now he came every evening, dressed for the occasion, and actually engaged in conversation rather than the monosyllabic responses that had characterized their early months together. He asked about her day, what she had read, what improvements she was considering for the household. He solicited her opinions on matters of estate management, seeming genuinely interested in her thoughts on tenant relations and domestic economy. Catherine was cautious at first, uncertainty making her responses careful and measured. This new attention confused her, left her uncertain of its source or durability. Was it simply concern for the child she carried, an extension of his vigilance over his heir, or had something genuinely shifted in how he saw her? She could not tell, and she had been disappointed too many times to allow herself easy trust. But Sebastian persisted with a patience she had not known he possessed, and gradually, like a flower turning toward unexpected sunlight, Catherine began to open. Her responses grew longer, more animated. She offered opinions without hedging them with qualifiers. She smiled more readily, laughed occasionally at his dry observations about the absurdities of parliamentary politics. The dinners stretched longer, neither in any hurry to conclude the conversation and retreat to solitary chambers. One evening in late May, they fell into a spirited discussion about a novel they had both read, Richardson's Clarissa, and found themselves on opposite sides. Catherine argued passionately that Clarissa's tragedy stemmed from society's impossible standards for female virtue, that she was victimized as much by social strictures as by Lovelace himself. Sebastian countered that while society's role was undeniable, Clarissa's own rigidity and pride contributed to her downfall, that more flexibility might have saved her. But that's precisely the problem, Catherine said, her eyes bright with the heat of intellectual engagement, leaning forward in her chair. Why should she have to be flexible? Why should the burden of adaptation fall always on the woman, while men like Lovelace face no consequences for their... She stopped abruptly, catching herself, suddenly aware that she had been arguing with the Duke of Ashford as though they were equals, that she had interrupted him and spoken with a passion that bordered on impropriety. Old habits of self-effacement reasserted themselves, and she shrank back slightly, expecting the cold displeasure that would surely follow such presumption. Instead, she found Sebastian smiling at her, actually smiling, a genuine expression of pleasure that transformed his usually austere features into something approaching warmth. "Don't stop," he said, his voice carrying an encouragement she had never heard from him before. "Please, I like seeing this side of you. You were about to make a point about consequences, I believe." Catherine stared at him, uncertain how to proceed, her heart doing something dangerous and foolish in her chest. He wanted to hear her thoughts. He liked her passion. He was looking at her as though she were not merely present, but interesting, worthy of attention and intellectual respect. Something unfurled in her chest, fragile and tentative hope, that treacherous emotion she had thought she had buried after months of cold neglect. "I was going to say," she continued slowly, testing this new ground, "that men like Lovelace face no social consequences for ruining women, while the women themselves are destroyed by it. The entire structure is designed to protect male prerogative, while punishing female vulnerability." "A fair point," Sebastian conceded. "Though one might argue that Lovelace does face consequences. He dies in a duel, does he not? Only after ruining how many women? And he dies for offending another man's honor, not for the actual harm he caused Clarissa. That's rather my point." They continued in this vein for another hour, the argument ranging across literature and philosophy and the structures of society itself. The servants cleared the dishes and withdrew, leaving the candles to burn low, and still Sebastian and Catherine talked, discovering the pleasure of matched intellects and genuine exchange. When Sebastian finally rose to retire, he walked Catherine to her chamber door, a courtesy he had never before extended. He paused there in the hallway, candlelight flickering between them, and seemed to want to say something more. His hand lifted slightly, as though he might touch her face, then fell back to his side. "Thank you," he said finally, "for the conversation, for your thoughts. I find I've been starving for genuine discourse without realizing it." "As have I," Catherine admitted quietly. Their eyes held for a moment longer, something unspoken passing between them, before Sebastian bowed slightly and retreated to his own chambers. Catherine entered her room in a daze, her mind replaying every moment of the evening, and allowed herself, for the first time in months, to hope that perhaps her marriage might become something more than the cold transaction it had begun as. In early June, an unseasonable cold snap swept through the region, bringing with it grey skies and a persistent chill that seemed to seep through even Ashford Hall's thick stone walls. Catherine, 7 months pregnant now and more susceptible to every change in weather, caught a chill after sitting too long by a draughty window in the library. It was minor, a slight fever, a cough, nothing that truly alarmed Dr. Thornbury when he was summoned, but Sebastian's reaction was entirely disproportionate to the actual danger. He became almost frantic with worry, his usual composure cracking to reveal something raw and frightened beneath. He moved his entire working operation to the chair beside Catherine's bed, spreading ledgers and correspondence across a hastily positioned table, refusing to leave her side, even when she insisted weakly that she was perfectly fine, and he was being absurd. He brought her tea himself rather than trusting servants with the task, testing the temperature with his own lips before allowing her to drink. He piled blankets over her until she protested she would suffocate, then removed half of them with reluctant concession. He read to her for hours, his voice a constant, soothing presence, even when she drifted in and out of feverish sleep. On the second day of her illness, Catherine slipped into a deeper sleep in the afternoon, her breathing congested but steady, her cheeks flushed with fever. Sebastian sat beside her, pretending to review estate accounts, but actually watching the rise and fall of her chest, monitoring each breath as though his vigilance alone could keep her tethered to health. In her sleep, Catherine stirred restlessly, her head turning on the pillow, and murmured something indistinct. Sebastian leaned closer, thinking she might be waking, might need something. Her lips moved again, forming words barely louder than breath. "Why couldn't you have wanted me too?" The words were slurred with fever and sleep, but perfectly clear in the quiet room. They struck Sebastian like a physical blow, piercing through all his careful defenses to lodge somewhere in the region of his heart. "Too," she had said too, as though she understood that he wanted the child, wanted the heir, but could not understand why that want had never extended to include her, as though she had been hoping, all these months, that he might come to want her as well, not for function or duty, but for herself. The truth of what he had done to her, the loneliness he had condemned her to, crashed over him with devastating clarity. Catherine woke an hour later to find Sebastian still sitting beside her, but something had changed in his expression. He was looking at her with an intensity she could not decipher, something haunted and hungry, and lost all at once. His ledgers lay forgotten, untouched for however long she had been sleeping. "Catherine," he began, and her name on his lips sounded like a prayer or perhaps a plea. Then he stopped, the words he needed hovering just beyond his reach. He was a man who had commanded armies in his youth, who managed vast estates and navigated the treacherous waters of parliamentary politics, who could calculate complex figures in his head and negotiate deals that would make lesser men tremble. But he could not find words for what he felt in this moment, the guilt and longing and desperate wish to undo months of neglect, to go back to their wedding day and begin again, to want her from the start, the way he was beginning to understand that he wanted her now. The words would not come. They tangled in his throat, inadequate and clumsy, unable to bridge the distance his own coldness had created. Instead, he reached out slowly, giving her time to pull away if she wished, and took her hand in both of his. He simply held it, feeling the delicate bones and cool skin, the flutter of her pulse at her wrist. He held her hand as though it were something precious, something he had nearly lost through his own blindness and was only now learning to value. Catherine looked at their joined hands, then up at his face, confusion and cautious hope warring in her grey eyes. She did not pull away. Sebastian met her gaze and tried to pour into that look everything he could not yet articulate: apology and recognition, regret for the past, and promise for whatever future they might build. For now, in the quiet of her sick room with the afternoon light fading beyond the windows, it was enough. Not forgiveness, perhaps, not yet understanding, but a beginning, a tentative bridge across the chasm that had separated them. Catherine's fingers curled slightly, returning the pressure of his grip, and they sat together in silence as the shadows lengthened and the fever broke, and something new and fragile began to take shape between them. As summer faded and autumn arrived with its palette of gold and crimson, Sebastian's transformation became apparent to everyone in the household and beyond. The cold, austere Duke of Ashford was thawing in ways that would have seemed impossible 6 months prior. He smiled more readily, the expression reaching his eyes and softening the harsh planes of his face. He laughed occasionally, actual laughter, not the sardonic chuckle he might offer at political ironies, but genuine amusement at Catherine's observations or the absurdities of daily life. Most noticeably, he was always aware of where Catherine was, what she needed, attuned to her presence in a way that suggested she had become the center around which his world revolved. He interrupted business meetings if he thought she might need him. He noticed when she was tired before she mentioned it. He anticipated her wants with an attentiveness that bordered on uncanny, as though he were making up for months of deliberate blindness by seeing everything now. The servants whispered among themselves that His Grace was falling in love with his own wife, and wasn't it the strangest and loveliest thing they'd ever witnessed? Mrs. Pemberton smiled knowingly and said she'd seen it coming since the night he'd carried Her Grace home from that dreadful ball. But the younger maids insisted it was the most romantic transformation they'd ever seen, like something from the novels they borrowed from the library when they thought no one noticed. When Henrietta came to visit in mid-October, she observed the change immediately. She watched Sebastian's eyes follow Catherine across the drawing room, noticed how his entire countenance softened when his wife spoke, saw the small unconscious gestures of care and attention he offered constantly. During a private moment while Sebastian was occupied with his steward, Henrietta took Catherine's hands and said with warm certainty, "He's finally seeing you, dear, really seeing you. I told you the Blackwood men were slow, but they generally get there eventually." But Catherine, despite the evidence accumulating around her, was afraid to believe. She had been invisible for so long, had resigned herself so completely to a marriage of cold duty, that this new tenderness felt dangerously fragile, something that might evaporate if she acknowledged it too directly. Surely this was temporary, she told herself. Surely it was simply concern for the child she carried, an extension of his protectiveness over his heir that happened to include her by necessity. Once the baby was born and the succession secured, surely Sebastian would retreat back into his cold distance, and she would be alone again. She could not bear to hope otherwise and be disappointed. One evening in late October, as they sat together in the library after dinner, their place now, where they spent most evenings in companionable reading or conversation, Sebastian rose and retrieved something from his coat pocket. "I have something for you," he said, and there was an unusual hesitancy in his voice, an uncertainty that sat strangely on a man usually so assured. He handed her a small wrapped package. Catherine opened it with trembling fingers and found inside a first edition of Mary Wollstonecraft's A Vindication of the Rights of Woman, a book she had mentioned wanting months ago. In passing, during one of their garden walks. She had not mentioned it since, had barely remembered the comment herself, but Sebastian had remembered. He had sought it out, purchased it, kept it until the right moment. "Sebastian," she whispered, looking up at him with tears threatening at the corners of her eyes. "I can't believe you remembered." He sat down beside her on the settee, closer than propriety strictly required, his expression more vulnerable than she had ever seen it. "I remember everything you say now," he admitted quietly. "I'm trying to make up for all the months when I didn't listen, didn't see, didn't." He struggled for words, his usual eloquence deserting him. "Catherine, I haven't been what you deserved. I haven't been even a fraction of what you deserved. I was cold and cruel, and so determined to protect myself from feeling anything that I failed to see the extraordinary woman right in front of me." His hand found hers, lacing their fingers together. "I'm trying to be better. I want to be better. For you." The "for you" echoed in the space between them, heavy with meaning. Not for the heir, not for duty or appearance. For her. Catherine looked at their joined hands, at his face so earnest and uncertain, and felt the walls around her heart walls she had built for self-preservation begin to crack. "I don't know how to trust this," she said honestly, her voice barely above a whisper. "I want to, but I'm afraid." Winter settled over Ashford Hall in earnest as November gave way to December, blanketing the estate in snow and shortening the days to brief grey intervals between long nights. Catherine was 8 months pregnant now, her body heavy and ungainly, the child within her active and demanding, making sleep difficult and comfort nearly impossible to achieve. She moved slowly through the house, one hand always pressed to the small of her aching back, the other resting on the pronounced swell of her belly. She was preparing for the birth with the mixture of anticipation and dread that all women felt approaching that threshold, knowing that she would soon cross into territory where wealth and position offered no protection, where duchess and scullery maid faced the same dangers and the same uncertain outcome. Sebastian was openly anxious now, his hovering reaching levels that would have been comical if Catherine hadn't found it oddly endearing. He insisted on helping her navigate stairs, offered his arm for the shortest walks, questioned Dr. Thornbury relentlessly about every symptom and sensation she reported. At night, he lay awake in his chambers, listening through the connecting door for any sign of distress, any indication that labor might be beginning. One snowy evening in mid-December, they sat together in the library, as had become their custom, the fire crackling cheerfully in the hearth, candlelight casting warm shadows across the room. Catherine occupied the settee, her feet elevated on an ottoman, knitting something small and soft to blanket for the baby, her needles clicking with rhythmic steadiness. Sebastian sat in the nearby wingback chair with a book open in his lap, though he had not turned a page in 20 minutes, his attention fixed instead on his wife. She looked peaceful in the firelight, her face softened with the inward focus that pregnancy brought, and he thought not for the first time how close he had come to never knowing this, never seeing her, never caring enough to want these quiet evenings that had become the best part of his days. "Are you frightened?" he asked quietly, breaking the comfortable silence. Catherine looked up from her knitting, understanding immediately what he meant. Of the birth. At his nod, she set down her needles and folded her hands over her belly. "Terrified," she admitted. "My mother died birthing my youngest brother. I was 12. I remember." She trailed off, the memory clearly painful. "I remember how long it took, and how the midwife's face grew grimmer as the hours passed, and how my father looked afterward, hollowed out, like something essential had been carved away." Sebastian felt ice settle in his stomach at her words. He rose from his chair and moved to sit beside her on the settee, close enough that their bodies touched from shoulder to hip, closer than propriety demanded, but exactly where he needed to be. "I won't let anything happen to you," he said with fierce certainty, as though will alone could protect her from the dangers inherent in bringing life into the world. Catherine turned to look at him, and her smile was sad, knowing. "You can't promise that, Sebastian. No one can. Childbirth takes women every day, rich and poor, young and old. It doesn't care about titles or intentions." "No," he admitted, the word rough in his throat. He took her hand, held it tightly. "You're right. I can't promise you'll be safe, much as I wish I could, but I can promise I'll be here. I'll be with you through all of it, if you'll allow it." "Propriety be damned." He paused, then reached up with his free hand to gently turn her face toward his, making sure she saw the absolute truth in his eyes. "And Catherine, I can promise you this. If something were to happen, it wouldn't be just an heir I'd be losing." His voice dropped to barely above a whisper. "It would be you, and that terrifies me more than anything else in this world." Catherine stared at him, her grey eyes wide and shining with unshed tears. "Sebastian, I know I have no right to say these things," he continued, the words coming faster now, as though a dam had broken. "I know I've given you no reason to believe me, that I've been cold and cruel and everything a husband shouldn't be. But somewhere in these past months, you became essential to me, not as the mother of my heir, but as yourself. Catherine, the woman who reads philosophy and improves my estate and makes me laugh and sees the world with such clarity and kindness. The woman I should have valued from the beginning but was too blind and stupid to recognize." A single tear traced down Catherine's cheek. "I thought you only cared about the baby." "So did I," Sebastian said with brutal honesty, "until you collapsed in that ballroom and I realized the thought of losing you was unbearable. Until I started actually seeing you and couldn't understand how I'd ever looked at anything else. Until these evenings together became the only hours of my day that truly matter." He lifted her hand to his lips, pressed a kiss to her knuckles. "I'm falling in love with you, Catherine. Perhaps I've been falling all along and was too foolish to know it." The moment hung between them, suspended and fragile, weighted with months of loneliness and longing, with words too long unspoken and feelings too carefully hidden. The fire crackled in the hearth, snow whispered against the windows, and in the warm cocoon of the library, everything outside this moment ceased to exist. "Sebastian," Catherine whispered, and it was the first time she had used his given name without his title, the intimacy of it striking them both. "When did this happen? When did I become more to you than just a duty?" He was quiet for a long moment, his thumb tracing absent patterns on the back of her hand, his brow furrowed, as though trying to solve an equation that had no clear solution. "I don't know," he finally admitted. "Slowly, I think. Then all at once. Perhaps it began that night I found you asleep in the library and really looked at you for the first time. Or when I caught you on the stairs and felt that jolt of recognition, as though my body knew something my mind refused to acknowledge. Perhaps it was when you collapsed at the ball and I realized that the thought of a world without you in it was unbearable, not because of what you represented, but because of who you are." He reached up with his free hand and touched her face with hesitant gentleness, his fingers tracing the curve of her cheekbone, the line of her jaw, as though memorizing her features. Or perhaps it was happening all along, in every small moment I was too blind to notice. Every kindness you showed the servants, every intelligent observation you made. Every evening you sat across from me at dinner and tried to create connection while I gave you nothing in return. His voice roughened with emotion. "I was so determined to keep my heart locked away, Catherine. After my mother died, after I saw what my father became in his grief, a broken man who gambled away our fortune trying to feel something other than loss, I decided that feeling nothing was strength, that if I never cared, I could never be destroyed by caring. I built walls around everything that might be vulnerable and told myself I was being practical, responsible, strong." He leaned his forehead against hers, their breath mingling in the small space between them. "But you quiet, patient, impossibly kind, you picked the lock without my even noticing. You slipped past every defense I'd built, not through force but through simple, persistent presence. And now I find that what I thought was strength was actually cowardice, and real courage is allowing myself to love you, even though the thought of losing you terrifies me beyond reason." Catherine's eyes filled with tears that spilled over, tracking down her cheeks in the firelight. "I've wanted to hear something like this for so long," she said, her voice breaking. "From the moment I signed that contract, some foolish part of me hoped that perhaps you might come to care for me. But as the months passed and you remained so cold, so distant, I told myself to stop hoping. I convinced myself that being invisible was my fate, that I would raise our child and manage your household and live my entire life unseen by the one person I most wanted to see me. I thought you'd never—" She couldn't finish the sentence. Sebastian saw the pain in her eyes, the months of loneliness and resignation she had endured because of his willful blindness, and something broke open in his chest. He closed the last small distance between them and kissed her. It was nothing like their wedding night, nothing like that clinical, dutiful consummation that had been respectful and proper and utterly devoid of feeling. This kiss was soft, tentative, reverent. His lips moved against hers with a gentleness he hadn't known he possessed, asking rather than taking, offering rather than demanding. It was an apology for every moment he had failed to see her. It was a promise that he saw her now, and would never stop seeing her. It was a beginning, the first true beginning of their marriage, 8 months late, but finally, impossibly real. Catherine's hand came up to cup his face, her fingers trembling against his jaw, and she kissed him back with all the pent-up longing she had been storing away in the lonely months of their marriage. When they finally broke apart, both breathing unsteadily, Sebastian rested his forehead against hers once more. "I love you," he said, simple and direct, the words he should have been saying for months. "I love you, Catherine, and I will spend the rest of our lives proving it to you, if you'll let me." "I already love you," she whispered back. "I think I've loved you longer than I should have, hoping against hope that someday you might feel the same." He kissed her again, deeper this time, and in the firelit library, while snow fell softly outside and their child moved between them. Sebastian and Catherine Blackwood finally became what they should have been from the start, not just husband and wife, but partners, lovers, two people choosing each other not out of duty but out of love. The final month of Catherine's pregnancy transformed Ashford Hall in ways that had nothing to do with the nursery preparations or the arrival of baby linens and tiny gowns. The transformation was in the air itself, in the way warmth had finally permeated the cold stone walls, in how laughter echoed through corridors that had known only austere silence for years. Sebastian moved his chambers to the room adjacent to Catherine's, abandoning the Duke's traditional suite in the far wing without a second thought. He wanted to be close if she needed him in the night, wanted no barriers between them, propriety be damned. They fell into the habit of talking through the connecting door as they prepared for bed, sharing thoughts about the day, discussing books or estate matters, or simply murmuring comfortable nonsense until one or both of them drifted into sleep. Sometimes Catherine would wake in the deep hours of night, uncomfortable and unable to find rest, and would call softly through the door, and Sebastian would come immediately, helping her arrange pillows or walking with her slowly through the rooms until the baby settled and she could attempt sleep again. He was openly affectionate now in ways that would have shocked anyone who had known him before. He touched her constantly, taking her hand as they walked, brushing hair back from her face, resting his palm against the pronounced swell of her belly to feel their child kick and roll beneath his touch. The first time the baby moved strongly under his hand, his face had transformed with such wonder and joy that Catherine had felt tears spring to her eyes. "He's strong," Sebastian had murmured, and Catherine had gently corrected. Or she. He had smiled, that full, genuine smile she was learning to treasure. "Our child," he said, as though testing the words and finding them perfect. "Our family." Catherine bloomed under this attention, this love she had stopped allowing herself to hope for. Color returned to her cheeks that had nothing to do with pregnancy and everything to do with happiness. She smiled readily, laughed often, and the servants remarked that her grace looked more beautiful now, heavy with child and ungainly, than she had on her wedding day, because now she glowed with something that had nothing to do with fashion or cosmetics, and everything to do with being loved. They made plans together in the evenings, sitting close on the library settee or in Catherine's sitting room, discussing everything from the nursery arrangements to the child's eventual education. Sebastian solicited Catherine's opinions on every decision, making it clear that they were partners in this, that her thoughts mattered as much as his. They spoke of the future of perhaps having more children, if Catherine was willing and survived this birth safely, of improvements to the estate, of the life they would build together, now that they had finally found each other. "Boy or girl, I don't care," Sebastian said one night as they lay in Catherine's bed together. He had taken to staying with her in the evenings, holding her as her belly made comfortable rest nearly impossible, leaving only when she finally dozed. "I know I said I needed an heir, that it was all about succession and duty, but truly, Catherine, I don't care anymore. Boy or girl, as long as you both survive it, as long as you're safe." Catherine turned in his arms to look at him in the dim candlelight. "And then?" she asked softly. "After the birth, when the child is here and the succession is secured, what then?" Sebastian cupped her face in his hands, his expression more serious than she had ever seen it. "Then I spend the rest of my life making up for the months I wasted not loving you properly," he said. "Then I show you every single day that you are the most important thing in my world, more essential than titles or estates or anything else I once thought mattered. Then we raise our child together, children, if we're blessed with more, and we build the life we should have had from the beginning. A life based on love and partnership and genuine care for each other." He kissed her forehead, her cheeks, finally her lips. Then we live, Catherine. Truly live, not just exist. Together, she believed him. For the first time since signing that contract 9 months ago, Catherine allowed herself to fully believe in the possibility of happiness, in a future that held not just duty, but joy. She rested her head against Sebastian's chest, listening to the steady beat of his heart, feeling their child move between them, and thought that perhaps the difficult beginning had been necessary to make them appreciate what they had found. Perhaps they would value this love more for having nearly missed it entirely. The labor began on a cold January night, 3 days into the new year, with Catherine waking to a tightening across her belly that she knew immediately was different from the practice pains she had been experiencing for weeks. She called softly through the connecting door, and Sebastian was there in moments, already alert though it was barely past midnight. When Dr. Thornbury confirmed that the birth was indeed beginning, he suggested, as convention dictated that His Grace might wish to wait in his study while the women attended to the business of childbirth. Sebastian's response was immediate and unequivocal. He would not leave his wife. Propriety could go hang. He was staying. The hours that followed were the longest of Sebastian's life. He remained at Catherine's side through all of it, holding her hand, wiping her brow with cool cloths, whispering encouragement when she had breath to hear it. He was terrified, more frightened than he had ever been in his life, more than when he had commanded troops in skirmishes as a young man, more than when he had faced financial ruin, but he tried not to show it, tried to be strong for her when she needed strength. Catherine was in agony as the hours stretched on, her body racked with pains that came in waves, each one seeming worse than the last. She gripped Sebastian's hand with crushing force, and he welcomed the pain of it, wished he could take more from her, wished he could bear any of this himself rather than watch her suffer. "I'm here," he kept saying, like a prayer or a promise. "I'm here, my love. You're so strong. I'm right here." Dawn came grey and cold, and still the labor continued. Dr. Thornbury's face grew increasingly concerned as morning stretched toward afternoon, and Sebastian felt panic rising in his throat. Finally, as the winter sun began its early descent, Catherine gave a final, agonized push, and the room filled with a new sound, a baby's cry, lusty and strong and achingly beautiful. "A son," Dr. Thornbury announced, wrapping the baby quickly. "A healthy son, Your Grace." Sebastian barely registered the words, his attention fixed on Catherine, who had collapsed back against the pillows, her face grey with exhaustion. He reached for her hand, smiled at her. "You did it, my love. He's here. He's perfect." But Dr. Thornbury's face had gone grave, and suddenly there was urgent activity, the midwife moving quickly, towels that shouldn't be soaked in red. "She's hemorrhaging," the physician said quietly, and Sebastian's world narrowed to a single, terrible point of focus. Not the son he had supposedly needed so desperately. Only Catherine, her pale face, and her weak breath, the way her eyes were drifting closed, as though sleep were pulling her somewhere he could not follow. "No," Sebastian said, and his voice broke on the word. He gripped her hand tighter, leaned close to her face. "Catherine, no. Stay with me. Please. I'm begging you. Stay with me." His composure, so carefully maintained through the long labor, shattered completely. Tears fell on their joined hands as he pleaded with her. "I've only just found you. We've only just begun. You can't leave me now. Please, Catherine. Please." Catherine heard his voice through layers of exhaustion and pain, heard the naked fear and grief in it, felt wetness on her hand that she realized dimly were his tears. She was so tired, more tired than she had ever been, and it would be so easy to just let go, to drift into the darkness that was calling her. But Sebastian was calling her too, his voice broken and desperate, and she heard in it everything they would lose if she surrendered now. Their son, who she hadn't even held yet. The life they had planned together. The love they had only just discovered. She thought of all the months she had been invisible to him, and how she had finally become seen, and how cruel it would be for that to end now, just as everything was beginning. So she fought. With what strength remained in her exhausted body, she fought against the darkness pulling at her. For Sebastian, whose tears she could feel. For their son, whose cry she could hear somewhere in the distance. For the future they deserved after such a difficult beginning. She held on to Sebastian's hand like an anchor, and refused to let the darkness claim her. Breath by breath, heartbeat by heartbeat, choosing life over the terrible ease of surrender. Catherine survived. Dr. Thornbury's quick action and Catherine's own stubborn will pulled her back from the edge, though the hours immediately following were touch and go, Sebastian refusing to move from her bedside even when the physician assured him she was stable. The recovery was slow, painfully so, with Catherine too weak at first to even hold her own child, but Sebastian never left her side except when absolutely forced to by the most pressing estate business, and even then he returned as quickly as possible, as though afraid she might slip away in his absence. He brought their son to her in those first fragile days, settling the tiny, squirming bundle carefully in her arms when she was too weak to lift him herself, supporting both of them with gentle hands. Catherine looked down at the small face, features still red and wrinkled from birth, and felt overwhelming love crash over her. "He's perfect," she whispered, tears sliding down her cheeks. "Absolutely perfect." Sebastian sat on the edge of the bed beside them, one arm around Catherine's shoulders, gazing at his son with an expression of wonder. "He has your nose," he observed, "and hopefully your disposition. One of me in the world is quite enough." Catherine laughed weakly, then winced at the pain the movement caused. "What shall we name him?" she asked. Sebastian was quiet for a moment, studying the baby with thoughtful intensity. "Thomas," he finally said, "if that pleases you." "After my father?" Catherine asked, surprised and touched that Sebastian would honor her family so. "No," Sebastian said quietly. "After the father I hope to be, not the one I had." He looked at Catherine, his expression vulnerable. "My father was cold, distant, more concerned with his own pleasures than with his family. He taught me that emotion was weakness and that duty was everything. I don't want that for Thomas. I want him to grow up knowing he's loved, that his happiness matters, that feelings aren't something to be locked away and feared." His hand moved to cover Catherine's where she held their son. "I want to be the kind of father, the kind of man you've taught me I can be." In the weeks that followed, as Catherine slowly regained her strength and color returned to her cheeks, their little family took shape in the sunny rooms of Ashford Hall. Sebastian was a devoted father, constantly amazed by every small detail of his son, the tiny fingers that gripped his own, the way Thomas would quiet to the sound of his voice, the serious expression the baby wore when studying the world with unfocused eyes. But more than a devoted father, Sebastian was a devoted husband. He told Catherine daily that he loved her, the words coming more easily with repetition but never losing their weight. He brought her flowers from the conservatory, read to her during her convalescence, sat with her for hours simply talking or existing in comfortable silence. He made up for lost time with an intensity that sometimes overwhelmed her, as though he were determined to compress into every day the affection and attention he should have been giving her all along. One afternoon, as Catherine sat in the window seat nursing Thomas while Sebastian watched from the nearby chair, she asked him something that had been on her mind. "Tell me the story," she said softly. "Tell me how this happened, how we got from there to here." Sebastian smiled, that full, warm smile that still surprised her sometimes with its transformation of his features. "Once upon a time," he began with gentle humor, "there was a foolish duke who thought he had everything figured out. He thought he could order his life like a ledger, keep everything controlled and predictable and safe. He thought that if he never allowed himself to feel anything, he could never be hurt. He rose and came to sit beside Catherine, his arm going around her shoulders. Then a quiet, patient woman came into his life, and she was everything he didn't know he needed. She was kind where he was cold, open where he was closed, brave where he was cowardly. And though he was too stupid to see what was right in front of him, she waited. She endured his coldness with grace, and slowly, without even trying, she taught him that the walls he had built to protect himself were actually a prison. He pressed a kiss to Catherine's temple. "You saved me," he said seriously. "I was barely alive. Catherine just going through motions, existing but not living. You taught me how to feel again, how to love, how to be human instead of just a collection of duties and titles." Catherine leaned into his warmth, their son between them. "I didn't do anything special. I just loved you, even when you couldn't love me back." "That's everything," Sebastian said quietly. "That's the whole story. You loved me until I learned how to love you in return." Spring arrived at Ashford Hall with an explosion of color and life that seemed to mirror the transformation within the estate's walls. The gardens that Catherine had quietly arranged to have properly tended now burst with daffodils and early tulips. The trees leafed out in tender green, and the air carried the scent of growing things and new possibilities. Catherine stood on the terrace one warm April afternoon, stronger now, her body having recovered from the trauma of Thomas's birth, watching Sebastian play with their son on a blanket spread beneath the ancient oak tree at the garden's heart. Thomas was 3 months old now, beginning to smile and coo, and Sebastian lay on his stomach beside the baby, making absurd faces that sent Thomas into fits of delighted gurgling. The sound of her husband's laughter carried across the garden, and Catherine marveled at the change in him. This man who had once seemed incapable of joy, now so full of it that it spilled over into everything he touched. The estate itself was flourishing not just financially, though Sebastian's careful management was finally bearing fruit in that regard as well, but with a warmth and vitality it had lacked for years. Servants smiled as they worked, singing sometimes when they thought no one was listening. Fires burned cheerfully in every occupied room. Flowers graced the tables. Children's laughter echoed through halls that had known only silence. Everything had color now where before there had been only gray, and Catherine knew that the change was not merely in the estate but in how she saw it, how happiness had painted over the loneliness that had tinted everything in those early months. Sebastian looked up from his position on the blanket, caught her watching, and smiled that particular smile he reserved only for her, the one that made her heart still flutter even now. He said something to Thomas, touching the baby's nose gently, then rose with fluid grace and came to her, crossing the garden with long strides. When he reached her, he wrapped his arms around her from behind, pulling her back against his chest, his chin resting on her shoulder in the easy intimacy they had developed. "Happy," he murmured against her hair, and she could hear the smile in his voice, the contentment that had replaced the cold calculation that used to define him. "More than I ever dreamed possible," Catherine admitted, leaning into his warmth. She turned her head slightly to see his profile. "That first day, when you barely looked at me during our meeting in your study, when you slid that contract across the desk like I was just another business transaction, I thought I was agreeing to a lifetime of loneliness. I thought I would spend decades in this house being invisible to you." Sebastian's arms tightened around her, and she felt him press a kiss to her temple. "I was looking," he confessed quietly. "I was just too afraid to see. Afraid that if I let myself feel anything attraction, interest, affection, I'd lose control, lose focus. My father fell apart after my mother died, let his emotions destroy everything, and I was so determined not to be like him that I tried to feel nothing at all." He turned her gently in his arms, so they faced each other, his hands coming up to frame her face. "I didn't understand that love doesn't make you weaker. It makes you stronger, braver, better. It gives you something worth fighting for, worth living for, instead of just existing in careful isolation." His thumbs brushed across her cheekbones in a gesture that had become familiar. "Beloved, you made me better, Catherine. You made me human again, made me want things beyond duty and obligation, made me care about something more than preserving a legacy." "You made yourself better," Catherine corrected gently. "I just gave you a reason to try." "You were the reason," Sebastian said. "You are the reason. For everything." He kissed her then, slow and sweet in the spring sunshine, while their son gurgled contentedly on the blanket and bees hummed among the flowers, and Ashford Hall stood solid behind them, no longer a prison of cold duty, but a home filled with love and laughter and the promise of all the years ahead. When they finally broke apart, Catherine rested her head against Sebastian's chest, listening to the steady beat of his heart, and thought about how far they had come from that grey autumn morning when she had signed away her future to a man who could not even look at her. How close they had come to missing this entirely. How grateful she was that Sebastian had learned to see her before it was too late, and that she had been patient enough to wait for him to find his way to her. "Come," Sebastian said, taking her hand. "Thomas is going to start wondering where we've gone, and I want to show him how his mother looks in spring sunlight. It's my favorite view in all the world." Catherine laughed and let him lead her across the garden to where their son waited, and as she settled on the blanket with her family around her, she thought that perhaps difficult beginnings made happy endings all the sweeter for having been so hard won. 3 years had passed since that cold January night when Catherine nearly slipped away, and Ashford Hall had been transformed so completely that visitors who remembered its former austerity barely recognized it. The estate was prosperous now, Sebastian's careful management finally bearing full fruit, but more than financial success, it radiated warmth and life. Laughter echoed through corridors that had once known only silence. Light poured through windows no longer shrouded in heavy drapery. And at the heart of it all was a family, not just a duke performing his duty, but a true family, bound by love rather than obligation. A daughter had joined their son, little Eleanor with her mother's grey eyes and her father's dark hair, barely a year old and already ruling the household with imperious infant demands. Thomas, now 3, was a serious child who studied the world with thoughtful attention and showed early signs of inheriting both his parents' intelligence. On a warm summer afternoon, Sebastian and Catherine walked together through the gardens, while their children played on a blanket nearby under Nurse's watchful eye. They moved hand in hand, comfortable in the way of couples who had weathered storms together and emerged not just intact, but stronger for the tempering. Their fingers laced together with unconscious ease, and they moved in comfortable silence, needing no words to fill the space between them. At dinner parties, and they hosted them now with genuine pleasure rather than cold obligation, people remarked on the Duke and Duchess of Ashford, how devoted they were to each other, how obviously in love, the way the Duke's eyes followed his wife across a room, the way the Duchess's face lit when her husband entered, the small touches they exchanged constantly, the private smiles, the sense that they existed in their own world, even in company. Who would have thought, the gossips whispered with romantic satisfaction, that when they married for purely practical reasons, everyone knew it had been nothing but a business arrangement. Theirs would become one of the great love stories of their generation. Sebastian still remembered, with crystalline clarity, the moment Catherine collapsed in the Pemberton ballroom, the rose-colored silk pooling on white marble. The memory could still fill him with retrospective terror, still make his heart clench, with the thought of how close he had come to losing her before he even knew what he had. But more than terror, the memory brought gratitude that she had collapsed when she did, shocking him out of the emotional paralysis he had mistaken for strength, grateful that she had survived the difficult birth that followed, grateful that she had been patient enough, kind enough, stubborn enough to love him even before he knew how to love her back, giving him time to find his way to her through his own darkness. "What are you thinking?" Catherine asked, noticing the distant expression on his face. Sebastian smiled and pulled her closer, pressing a kiss to her temple. "Just remembering how blind I was, how close I came to missing all of this. But you didn't miss it," Catherine said simply. "That's what matters. You found your way." "We found our way," he corrected, and they continued their walk, while their children's laughter carried across the garden, and the summer sun warmed the earth, and everything was exactly as it should be. Dear listener, sometimes the greatest transformations come not from grand gestures or dramatic declarations, but from quiet moments of awakening a woman asleep in a library chair, a hand caught on a staircase, a collapse on a ballroom floor that forces us to confront what we've been refusing to see. Sebastian needed an heir, that's true. He thought that was what mattered, what would secure his legacy and give meaning to his existence. But what he truly needed, though he didn't know it, was Catherine, someone to pick the lock on his guarded heart with patience and kindness, someone to teach him that vulnerability isn't weakness but courage, and that love doesn't diminish you or make you less, it completes you, makes you more fully human, gives you reasons to live instead of merely exist. Perhaps you know this feeling, of having what you thought you wanted only to discover that what you actually needed was something else entirely. The courage to open your heart even when you've convinced yourself that staying closed is safer. The patience to see potential beneath surfaces, to look past walls and defenses to the person hiding behind them. The wisdom to recognize that the practical choice and the heart's choice need not be different things, if only we're brave enough to let transformation happen. Remember that people are capable of profound change when given the right reason, the right person, the right moment of clarity. And sometimes, that reason is the quiet, steady love of someone who sees past your carefully constructed walls to the person you could become, if only you had the courage to try. May you find or be that reason for someone. May you have the courage to let transformation happen, even when it frightens you, even when it means dismantling everything you thought protected you. May you recognize love even when it arrives in unexpected forms, wearing grey dresses and asking for nothing, offering everything. May you be patient enough to wait for hearts to thaw, and brave enough to thaw your own. Rest well, dear listener, knowing that even the coldest hearts can learn to warm, and even the loneliest souls can find their home. Know that it's never too late for new beginnings, that marriages of convenience can become marriages of love, and that the person you thought was just a means to an end might actually be the end itself, the purpose, the meaning, the reason for everything.